My name is Xenia Blythe. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, I was known as the reliable one, the calm one, the understanding one, the daughter who never made things harder. If you asked my family to describe me, they would say I'm thoughtful, responsible, mature beyond my years, the kind of woman who doesn't create conflict, the one who just handles it. And for a long time, I wore that reputation like a medal. I live a quiet life on the surface, stable career, clean apartment, no scandals, no dramatic social media posts, no loud opinions at dinner. People often mistake that stillness for softness, or worse, compliance. What they don't see is that silence can be a strategy. This story isn't about explosive arguments. There were no plates thrown, no doors slammed, no dramatic exits. There was no revenge plan, no screaming matches, no viral confrontation caught on someone's phone. This story is about something far more unsettling. It's about a single word, a word so small that, when I said it, no one in the room even realized what had just happened. But I did. Because that word didn't just interrupt a request, it interrupted a pattern for years. I had been the emotional glue in my family, the mediator, the problem solver, the one who stayed late, paid early, forgave quickly, and adjusted constantly. I told myself that being the good daughter meant being generous, flexible, selfless. What I didn't realize was how often selflessness quietly turns into self-erasure. There wasn't one catastrophic betrayal that woke me up. It was slower than that. Subtle, 1,000 tiny assumptions, 1,000 small expectations, 1,000 moments where my needs were postponed and everyone else's were prioritized. And the most dangerous part, I agreed to it. Not out of fear, not out of weakness, but out of love. This story is about what happens when love becomes one-sided, when kindness becomes an obligation, when being dependable becomes being taken for granted. It's about what changed inside me long before anyone else noticed. And it's about what happens when the person who always says, of course, finally says something else. I won't dramatize it. I won't villainize anyone. My family isn't evil. They're human. And so was I. But sometimes the most powerful shift in a family doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from withdrawal, from clarity, from choosing not to play a role anymore. If you've ever been the responsible one, the strong one, the one everyone leans on, have you ever wondered what would happen if you quietly stepped back? In my family, I wasn't the loud one. I wasn't the fragile one either. I was the dependable one. If my younger brother forgot to submit paperwork for college, I helped him redo it. If my mother felt overwhelmed planning holidays, I took over the spreadsheets. If my father was stressed about finances, I quietly reviewed statements and offered suggestions gently, never correcting, always just helping. No one asked me to become this person outright. But I noticed early that harmony had a cost, and I seemed naturally good at paying it. Growing up in Seattle, in a house where emotions were present but rarely processed, I learned that being low maintenance was rewarded. My brother's outbursts were excused as passion. My cousin's inconsistency was brushed off as creative, but my calmness, that was praised. You've always been so mature. Xenia, we don't have to worry about you. You're the strong one. It sounds like a compliment. And maybe it was. But it was also a quiet assignment. Strong meant I didn't need support. Mature meant I didn't need guidance. Reliable meant I didn't need rest. At family dinners, I was the one refilling glasses. During disagreements, I translated everyone's feelings into softer language when decisions needed to be made. I researched options and presented them clearly, then stepped back so someone else could take credit without losing face. And I told myself I preferred it that way. I liked being competent. I liked being the one people trusted. There is a certain dignity in quiet capability, being the steady presence in a room full of volatility, but steadiness can slowly turn invisible. There were moments, small ones, when I would finish organizing something complicated and hear someone say, "It all just worked out." Just as if things naturally arranged themselves, as if I hadn't stayed up until midnight double-checking contracts, as if I hadn't transferred money to cover a gap before anyone else noticed it existed. I didn't correct them. Correcting felt petty, and besides, I told myself I don't need applause. The truth was subtler than that. I didn't know how to ask for recognition without feeling selfish. So I became fluent in anticipation. I learned to solve problems before they were named. I remembered birthdays without reminders. I noticed tension before it escalated. Being needed felt like being loved. And the more capable I became financially stable, emotionally regulated, professionally successful, the more my family leaned on that capability. It wasn't malicious. No one sat in a room and decided I would carry more weight. It happened gradually, naturally. If there were a form to fill out, I would do it. If there were a bill to cover temporarily, I could manage it. If someone needed a place to stay just for a few weeks, my guest room was available. I became the infrastructure, and infrastructures don't get thanked. They get assumed. Still, I smiled. Still, I showed up. Still, I believed that this was what a good daughter does. The irony, the better I performed the role, the less anyone questioned whether I wanted it. I wasn't unhappy, but I was disappearing in plain sight. The first cut wasn't loud. It didn't come with an insult. It didn't arrive wrapped in cruelty. It came disguised as a joke. We were at my parents' house on a Sunday evening, the usual rotation. My mother had made roast chicken. My brother was late, as always. I had arrived early, as always, helping set the table while answering 2 emails from work in between. At some point during dinner, my father started talking about refinancing the house. "It's complicated," he said, shaking his head. "Banks just make everything confusing on purpose." I offered gently, "If you'd like, I can take a look at the documents this week." Before he could respond, my brother laughed. "Of course you can," he said. "Xenia's basically our unpaid family consultant." Everyone chuckled. Even my mother smiled. It was harmless on the surface, playful, light. I smiled too, but something in my chest tightened. Unpaid. It was said casually, as if it were obvious. As if my time, my skills, my energy were simply part of the family subscription plan. I waited for someone to add, "And we're lucky to have her," or "We really appreciate everything she does." No one did. The conversation moved on. My brother started talking about a trip he wanted to take. My father complained about interest rates. My mother asked if I could stay after dinner to help reorganize the garage since you're so good at systems. And I heard myself say, "Sure," not because I wanted to, but because that's what I always said. Later that night, as I drove back to my apartment through the soft Seattle rain, I replayed the moment. Unpaid family consultant. It wasn't about money. It was about an assumption. No one had asked whether I wanted to review mortgage documents. It was simply understood that I would, that I should, that I could. And because I could, I would. That was the contract I had never consciously signed. The next week, my father emailed me the refinancing paperwork. "No thank you in advance. No, only if you have time." Just a forwarded PDF with the subject line, "Look at this." I opened it at 10:47 p.m. after finishing my own workday. And as I scanned the numbers, I noticed something else. This wasn't the first time my help had been treated like a given. It was just the first time I felt it. There's a difference. Before, I had experienced these moments as normal family dynamics. Everyone contributes in their own way. I told myself. My brother helps with physical things. My mother hosts. I handle logistics. Balanced. But was it? When my brother booked that trip, he mentioned at dinner that no one joked about him being the family chauffeur when he occasionally drove our parents to appointments. No one called my mother the unpaid caterer after decades of hosting holidays. The humor only landed in one direction, and I realized something uncomfortable. I had trained them. Every time I said yes immediately, every time I minimized my effort, every time I brushed off acknowledgement, I reinforced the idea that my contribution required no ceremony, that it cost me nothing, that it was simply who I was. That night, I finished reviewing the refinancing documents. I sent back a clean, organized summary with recommendations. My father replied the next morning with 2 words. "Looks good." No emoji, no gratitude, no follow-up question, just confirmation. It was small. So small that if you asked anyone else, they'd say I was overthinking it. But I felt it. The first small cut, and once you feel the first cut, you start noticing where the blade has always been. After that dinner, nothing dramatic happened. No argument, no confrontation, no sudden shift in tone, which almost made it worse, because life continued exactly the same, and that sameness began to feel louder. A week after I reviewed the refinancing documents, my mother called. "Sweetheart, can you help your brother look over his lease agreement? He says the landlord is being vague." I glanced at the clock. It was 8:12 p.m. I had just changed into sweatpants and was heating up leftovers. "Sure," I said automatically. Of course I did. Later that night, my brother texted me a blurry photo of the contract instead of scanning it properly. I rewrote sections, clarified clauses, and even drafted a polite email he could send back to the landlord. His response: "You're the best." A heart emoji. On the surface, that sounds like appreciation. But appreciation without awareness feels hollow. He didn't ask how long it took me. He didn't offer to return the favor. He didn't even send the email I drafted. He edited it slightly and removed the parts that made him sound accountable. And I told myself he's younger. He's still figuring things out. That became my internal soundtrack. They don't mean it. They're stressed. You're just better at this stuff. The pattern expanded. My cousin needed help disputing a charge. My aunt wanted advice on setting up an online account. My parents assumed I'd manage tax season confusion because you understand these systems. Each request came with an invisible clause. "You'll handle it." And I did, but something inside me began to track it differently. I started noticing the tone. It wasn't, "Do you have time?" It was, "When can you look at this?" It wasn't, "Would you mind?" It was, "You're good at this." Competence had become currency, and I was spending it freely. The strange part is that no one ever insulted me outright. No one diminished my intelligence. In fact, they praised it often. But praise can be a leash if it keeps you performing. "You're the responsible one. You're so put together. We're lucky you're not dramatic." Not dramatic. I began to realize that what they meant was, "You don't make us uncomfortable. You don't ask for more. You don't disrupt the balance." And I had internalized that as a virtue. I rationalized everything. If I don't help, who will? It's just a few hours. They'd do it for me. But when I actually imagined asking them not for logistical help, but emotional or financial support, the image felt unrealistic. I couldn't picture my brother reviewing my contracts at midnight. I couldn't picture my father transferring money without commentary. I couldn't picture my mother reorganizing my life systems. Not because they were bad people, but because that wasn't the role they assigned themselves. And roles, once established, rarely shift without friction. One evening, after finishing yet another quick favor that stretched into 2 hours, I opened my leather planner and began listing the tasks I'd completed for family that month. Not out of resentment, out of curiosity. Mortgage review, lease analysis, tax clarification, budget restructuring, insurance comparison, holiday planning. It looked like a second job. And yet, if you asked my family, they would describe me as low maintenance. That's when the word settled quietly in my mind. Invisible. Not unseen they saw me, not unloved they loved me. But my effort had become background noise. And I had helped normalize it. Every time I absorbed the imbalance without comment, I confirmed that it was acceptable. Disrespect doesn't always arrive as cruelty. Sometimes it arrives as an expectation. And when expectation becomes routine, it stops looking like disrespect at all. It just looks like who you are. I wasn't angry yet, but I was beginning to wake up. There's a moment when you realize you're not just helping, you're performing, and the performance has a script. I didn't notice it at first because it felt natural, familiar, almost comforting. Every family has roles: the peacemaker, the rebel, the achiever, the caretaker. I was the stabilizer. If there was tension, I softened it. If there was confusion, I clarified it. If there was a risk, I minimized it. But one evening, while sitting at my kitchen counter with my planner open, I asked myself a question I had never asked before. What happens if I don't? Not in theory, not dramatically, just practically. What if I don't review the document? What if I don't step in? What if I don't anticipate? The question felt almost disloyal, because somewhere along the way, reliability had fused with identity. I wasn't just someone who helped, I was the one who helped, and that distinction matters. At the next family gathering, I paid closer attention. Not to what was said, but to what was assumed. My brother mentioned he might be short on rent for a month because of an unexpected expense. He didn't ask me directly for help. He didn't need to. My mother looked at me briefly. My father cleared his throat. The air shifted in a way that felt rehearsed. I recognized that choreography. It was subtle. No one said, "Xenia will handle it." but everyone waited. In that pause, I saw the role clearly for the first time. I was the contingency plan, the backup system, the invisible safety net no one acknowledged until they needed to fall. And the most unsettling part, I had built that safety net myself. I had offered loans without interest. I had solved problems before they escalated. I had positioned myself as competent enough to fix almost anything. Competence feels powerful until it becomes an obligation. That night, when the rent conversation resurfaced more directly, my brother said, half joking, if worst comes to worst, I know who my favorite sister is. I am his only sister. Everyone laughed. Again. And I felt something crystallize inside me. It wasn't anger, it was clarity. The role assigned to me wasn't accidental. It was reinforced, maintained, expected. Reliable, useful, invisible. No one asked whether carrying that role cost me anything, because I never showed the cost. I never said I was tired. I never expressed hesitation. I never set a boundary strong enough to be remembered. And when you don't define your limits, people define them for you. Driving home that night, I didn't feel hurt. I felt studied, like I was observing a system I had helped design. For the first time, I stopped asking whether they appreciated me enough and started asking a different question. Why did I need their appreciation to justify my own boundaries? That was the beginning of something quiet. Not rebellion, not confrontation, just awareness. And awareness, once awakened, doesn't go back to sleep easily. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen at a family dinner. It happened on a Tuesday morning, alone in my apartment, with rain tracing slow lines down the windows. I was reviewing my own finances, something I did at the beginning of every month. Clean spreadsheets, categorized expenses, long-term projections. I liked seeing my life in columns. It felt orderly, contained. That morning, I added a new column. Family, not emotionally, financially. I listed the loans I'd given over the past 3 years. Some repaid, some are partially repaid, some quietly forgotten. I added the indirect costs. 2 subscriptions I'd covered temporarily, emergency transfers, deposits, and travel changes. Then I calculated the time. Hours spent reviewing documents, drafting emails, comparing rates, planning holidays, mediating disputes. I wasn't trying to build a case. I was trying to see clearly. When I finished, I leaned back in my chair. The number didn't devastate me. I could afford it. That wasn't the point. The point was that I had never asked myself whether I wanted to afford it. I had assumed that because I was capable, I was obligated. And in that quiet apartment, with no one watching, I allowed myself a thought that felt almost forbidden. What if my generosity had become self-neglect? The word self-neglect startled me. It sounded dramatic. But when I examined it calmly, it wasn't dramatic at all. It was factual. I postponed a vacation last year because my brother needed help. I delayed replacing my car because my parents were restructuring debt. I accepted stress as normal because family comes first. Family does come first. But I had placed myself nowhere. And that's when something subtle but irreversible happened. I stopped framing my exhaustion as love. I stopped romanticizing overfunctioning as a virtue. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt responsible. Not for them. For me, that distinction is quiet, but it changes everything. Later that afternoon, my mother texted, "Can you call the insurance company for us? They're giving us the runaround again." I stared at the message longer than usual. Normally, I would respond within seconds. Of course, on it, no problem. Instead, I set the phone down. Not to ignore her, to think, why was I the default liaison? Why was my time automatically flexible? Why had I never asked whether they could make the call themselves? It wasn't about capability. It was about habit. And habits, once established, feel like character. I picked up my phone again. I typed a response. Deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. I realized I wasn't just choosing words. I was choosing identity. For years, my answer had been reflexive, automatic, predictable. This time, I wanted it to be intentional. The shift wasn't loud. There was no swelling music, no empowering montage. Just a woman sitting alone at her kitchen counter, recognizing that if she didn't change the script, no one else would. I didn't know yet what I would say. But for the first time in my life, I considered that I didn't have to say yes. And that possibility, That small, quiet possibility felt more powerful than any confrontation ever could. When I finally responded to my mother's text, it was 3 hours later. Not out of spite, out of deliberation. I won't be able to call today. I wrote, I have a full schedule. You might try asking for a supervisor that usually speeds things up. It wasn't a dramatic refusal. It wasn't even a full no. But it was the first time I didn't rearrange myself. Her reply came 10 minutes later. Oh, okay, we'll figure it out. No guilt, no accusation, no visible disappointment. Just that. And yet, I felt the tremor. Because the world didn't collapse. The insurance company did not win. My parents did not spiral. No one accused me of abandoning them. They figured it out. That night, I realized something unsettling. I had overestimated how necessary I was. Not in value, but in function. Over the next few weeks, I began experimenting quietly. When my brother texted, "Hey, can you look over something real quick?" I responded with, "What's your deadline?" instead of "send it." When my aunt asked if I could compare phone plans for her, I said, "I can send you a checklist of what to look for." I shifted from doing to advising, and the reactions were subtle but telling. There were longer pauses before replies. More, "Never mind, I'll handle it." Occasional, "It's fine, don't worry about it." The tone wasn't angry. It was recalibrating. What fascinated me most was how quickly they mistook my boundary for busyness. "You've been so busy lately," my mother said on a call. I didn't correct her. I wasn't busier. I was simply less available. Silence, I realized, is often interpreted as weakness when it's actually restraint. For years, I had filled every gap immediately. I had responded instantly, solved quickly, fixed quietly. Now, I let gaps exist. When a problem arose at dinner, I didn't jump in with solutions. I listened, I asked a question, I let the discomfort stretch. And I watched. My brother stumbled through explaining interest rates. My father Googled things mid-conversation. My mother made a call herself and later said, almost surprised, it wasn't that bad. They were capable, they just hadn't needed to be, because I had made it so easy not to. There's a dangerous comfort in being indispensable. It feeds the ego gently. It makes you feel chosen, special. But indispensability can also be a cage. The more essential you appear, the less free you become. I didn't announce my shift. I didn't gather everyone in the living room and declare new boundaries. I simply stopped volunteering, stopped preempting, stopped cushioning, and something interesting happened inside me. The anxiety I used to feel, that hum of responsibility running constantly in the background, began to quiet. Not disappear, but soften. I slept better. I worked with more focus. I started considering things for myself again. Small things, like taking a weekend trip without checking everyone's schedules first. No one confronted me, but I sensed the adjustment, like a system recalibrating after a component steps back. They were still used to the old version of me, the always available one, the automatic yes. They just didn't know yet that she was phasing out. What my family didn't notice wasn't my distance. It was my preparation. On the surface, I was still the same. I showed up to dinners. I answered calls, I remembered birthdays, I smiled at the right moments. But internally, I had shifted from reactive to strategic. When you stop constantly putting out fires, you suddenly have time to examine the architecture. And I began examining everything. Not with suspicion, with clarity. I revisited old financial arrangements, informal loans, shared subscriptions, emergency transfers. I gathered bank statements, email confirmations, text messages, not to build a case against anyone, but to understand the pattern of dependency in numbers instead of feelings. I realized something important. The imbalance wasn't just emotional, it was structural. There were recurring transfers labeled temporary. There were vague repayment timelines that quietly expired. There were shared responsibilities that had slowly migrated into my name because you're better with paperwork. At some point, I had become the default co-signer for stability. And defaults, once set, operate automatically. I also began educating myself more deeply, not about generosity, but about boundaries. I read about financial enmeshment, about family systems, about how competence in one sibling often becomes compensation for another's inconsistency. It wasn't personal, it was predictable, and that realization removed something dangerous: resentment. Resentment thrives in confusion. Clarity starves it. I wasn't angry at my brother for leaning on me. He leaned because I leaned forward. I wasn't angry at my parents for expecting support. They expected it because I delivered it without condition. The system wasn't malicious. It was efficient, and I had optimized it. So instead of pulling away emotionally, I repositioned quietly. I opened a separate savings account, one no one knew about, specifically labeled freedom. Not because I planned to cut ties, but because psychological independence often requires financial independence. I reviewed any shared commitments and ensured my name was removed where possible. If I had co-managed something, I would have transitioned it back. Not dramatically, gradually. I think it makes more sense if this stays under your login. I would say, let's simplify. I'll send you the steps. Each shift was small enough not to alarm anyone, but collectively, they rebalanced weight. I also changed something subtle in my internal narrative. Instead of thinking, if I don't do this, everything will fall apart, I began asking, if I don't do this, what will they learn? That question reframed everything. Because helping someone once can be love. Helping someone perpetually can be avoidance, theirs and yours. I started documenting conversations more carefully, not secretly, not obsessively, just intentionally. If I lent money, I clarified the terms in writing. If I declined something, I kept my tone neutral and consistent. No apologies layered in, no over-explanations. Clarity without aggression. What they never noticed was that I stopped trying to be liked for being useful. I started prioritizing being respected for being clear. There's a quiet difference between those two states. Usefulness earns praise. Clarity earns recalibration. At one dinner, my father began discussing a new investment idea. In the past, I would have immediately researched it and presented risks. This time, I said, "It sounds interesting. What's your plan for evaluating it?" He blinked slightly, then answered, slowly, thoughtfully. The conversation moved forward without me steering it, and I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because I was less involved, but because I was no longer carrying invisible insurance for every decision. They didn't notice the shift because I didn't make it dramatic. But internally, I was building something new. Not distance, not rebellion. Autonomy, and autonomy, once built carefully, becomes leverage. Not over others, over yourself. The reveal didn't happen in a room full of people. It happened in silence. On a Thursday evening, I sat at my dining table with my planner open, a folder of documents beside me, and my laptop glowing softly in the dim light. I wasn't looking for ammunition. I was looking for the truth. Over the past few weeks, I had gathered every informal agreement, every transfer, every temporary arrangement that had quietly extended beyond its original timeline. I organized them the way I organize everything: clean, chronological, unemotional, and when I stepped back, something crystallized. I wasn't just helpful, I was foundational. There were recurring expenses in my parents' monthly budget that relied on my predictable support. Not entirely, but enough that removing it abruptly would cause friction. There were small debts my brother assumed were flexible because they had always been flexible, because I had made them flexible. There were shared digital accounts, auto-renewals, and administrative details that still had my email attached as the primary contact. Not because anyone insisted, because I never corrected it. The private reveal wasn't about catching someone doing something wrong. It was about recognizing leverage, and that word used to make me uncomfortable. Leverage sounded manipulative, cold. But leverage, in its neutral form, simply means awareness of your position. I finally saw mine. If I withdrew support carelessly, it would feel like punishment. If I continued indefinitely, it would feel like erasure. But if I transitioned deliberately, it would feel like adulthood. The power wasn't in confrontation. It was a choice. That night, I wrote something in my planner. I am not obligated to subsidize other adults' comfort. Not because I didn't love them, but because love and subsidy are not synonyms. I realized something even more subtle. The real leverage wasn't financial, it was emotional. For years, the unspoken dynamic had been Xenia will handle it. That belief shaped their risk tolerance, their urgency, their planning. If I were always the safety net, why would they ever feel the full consequence of delay? I hadn't meant to shield them from growth, but that's what I had done. And in shielding them, I had limited myself. The reveal was quiet but profound. I didn't need to explode the system. I simply needed to step out of it. There's a difference between removing support and removing illusion. I chose the latter. Over the next few days, I began preparing for conversations that hadn't happened yet. Not rehearsing arguments. Clarifying principles. If asked for money, I would ask for a repayment timeline up front. If asked for time, I would assess my schedule honestly. If pressured emotionally, I would respond factually. No defensiveness. No guilt absorption. Just calm alignment. I also made one more decision that felt small but significant. I stopped checking in preemptively about their problems. If my brother mentioned a vague financial strain, I didn't follow up the next day, asking if he'd solved it. If my parents hinted at stress, I listened, but I didn't volunteer a fix. And something fascinating happened. They began handling things faster. Deadlines that used to drift suddenly had urgency. Calls that no one had time to make were made. Not perfectly, but adequately. The private reveal wasn't about discovering wrongdoing. It was about discovering that my constant intervention had quietly distorted accountability. And I had the power to restore balance not by force, but by absence. For the first time in my life, I understood that my value didn't come from how much I absorbed. It came from how clearly I stood. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, because I knew what was coming next. A moment where the old script would expect my automatic yes. And this time, I already knew the word I would say. The moment arrived quietly. Not during a crisis, not in a dramatic phone call. It came on a Sunday afternoon, after dinner, when everyone was relaxed enough to assume things would unfold the usual way. My brother had lost his job. Not catastrophically, not scandalously. The company downsized. It was unfortunate, but not unforeseeable. He had mentioned instability weeks earlier. We were sitting in my parents' living room. My mother's tea had gone cold. My father was staring at the carpet in that way he does when he's calculating silently. "I'll find something," my brother said, shrugging lightly. "But I might be short for a couple of months." There it was, the familiar pause. The air shifted in that subtle, rehearsed way I had come to recognize. No one looked at me directly, but everyone did. I could almost feel the old script sliding across the table toward me. Xenia will handle it. My mind didn't panic. It assessed. Option 1, transfer money quietly, as before, no terms, preserve harmony, reinforce pattern. Option 2, offer partial help with clear repayment terms, risk discomfort, introduce structure. Option 3, decline financial support entirely, offer emotional support instead, redefine the role permanently. Each option carried a cost. Not financial, relational. I understood something in that moment with startling clarity. Whatever I chose would set a precedent. Not just for this situation, for all future ones. If I softened now, every boundary I had been building silently would dissolve. If I overcorrected harshly, it would feel punitive. This wasn't about punishing my brother for losing his job. It was about refusing to subsidize his uncertainty as a reflex. My mother finally said it. "Maybe Xenia can help, just until you're back on your feet." Not demanding, hopeful. That's what made it harder. I looked at my brother. He wasn't ashamed. He wasn't entitled either. He was simply accustomed to the invisible safety net. And for the first time in my life, I felt the weight of being able to say yes. That's the part people don't talk about. Power isn't loud. It's the quiet knowledge that you could fix it. And choosing not to, I took a breath. Not dramatic, just steady. "I won't be able to cover your rent," I said evenly, "but I can help you plan the next steps. We can update your resume tonight if you want." Silence. Not explosive. Just unfamiliar. My brother blinked once, processing. "Oh," he said, "okay." My mother shifted slightly in her seat. My father cleared his throat. No one argued. No one accused. But something intangible cracked. Not the relationship. The expectation. I held my posture, calm, open, not defensive. "I'm here to support you," I added, "just not financially." There it was. The irreversible choice. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't emotional. It was precise. In that moment, I felt something settle inside me. Not guilt, not relief, alignment. Because for the first time, my answer wasn't automatic, it was intentional. And once a pattern is broken intentionally, it cannot return to unconscious form. They didn't know it yet, but the dynamic had shifted. And it shifted on one simple refusal. After that Sunday, no one confronted me. There was no family meeting, no emotional fallout, No late-night text accusing me of being cold. On the surface, everything looked normal, but underneath, the system was adjusting. And while they recalibrated emotionally, I moved practically. The first thing I did was formalize what had always been informal. I drafted a simple personal policy for myself not to share, but to follow. No financial support without written terms. No urgent assistance for problems that were predictable. Emotional support remains unlimited. Financial support does not. It wasn't rigid. It was clarifying. Then I reviewed any remaining shared commitments. There was still a streaming account under my name that everyone used. I transferred it to my parents and removed my card. Small detail, symbolic shift. There was an auto payment covering a minor family subscription. I sent a message. Just a heads up, I've removed my card from this. It renews next month under your account. Neutral, informational. No apology. No explanation beyond logistics. I also created distance in ways no one could see. I increased my automatic transfers into my Freedom Savings account. I diversified a small investment portfolio I had been delaying. I scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor, not because I was in trouble, but because I no longer wanted my future shaped by anyone else's emergencies. None of this was dramatic. None of it required confrontation. But every action quietly reinforced a new reality. I am not the family contingency plan. Meanwhile, my brother started applying for jobs more aggressively. I knew because he asked me to review his resume, and this time, he asked properly. Do you have time this week to look at it? Time, not an obligation. I checked my calendar before answering. I can on Thursday evening. No immediate availability, no midnight editing sessions, just scheduled support. And something subtle shifted in his tone when we worked on it. He was more prepared, more accountable, less passive. It wasn't resentment that changed him. It was friction. Without instant rescue, urgency sharpened. My parents, too, began adjusting. My mother mentioned she had called the insurance company again herself. They finally sorted it out, she said. There was a trace of pride in her voice. I smiled. Not because I had forced her to grow, but because I had stopped preventing it. Moving in silence doesn't mean plotting. It means aligning your actions before announcing your philosophy. I didn't post quotes about boundaries. I didn't lecture anyone about independence. I didn't reference psychology articles at dinner. I simply stopped cushioning outcomes. And here's what surprised me most. No one hated me. They were slightly unsettled, slightly less comfortable, slightly more aware, but not hostile. The catastrophe I had subconsciously feared that withdrawing financially would equal emotional exile never came. What came instead was distance. Healthy, breathable distance. And in that space, I felt something expand inside me. Time, energy, self-respect. The silence I once used to absorb everything had become something else entirely. It had become structured. And structures, once built, are harder to dismantle than emotions. They still believed I was the responsible one. They just didn't realize I had redefined what responsibility meant. The consequences didn't arrive with anger. They arrived with inconvenience, which, in families, is often more revealing. A month after that Sunday, my brother called, not to ask for money, to vent. I didn't get that job, he said. They said they went with someone who had more experience. I listened. In the past, I would have immediately shifted into problem-solving mode, rework the cover letter, optimize the interview answers, research alternative roles. This time, I let him finish. That's frustrating, I said calmly. What's your next move? There was a pause. I don't know, he admitted. Before, I would have filled that gap for him. Now, I let it sit. Consequences aren't punishments. They're teachers. And for the first time, he had to feel the full weight of uncertainty without the cushion of guaranteed financial backup. A few days later, my mother mentioned that things were a little tight this month. Not accusatory, just factual. In previous years, that statement alone would have triggered an offer from me. This time, I nodded. I hope it balances out soon, I said, and that was it. No transfer, no follow-up, no silent rescue. At dinner that weekend, I noticed something subtle but unmistakable. They were budgeting aloud. My father mentioned delaying a non-essential purchase. My mother talked about comparing grocery prices. My brother said he might take a short-term contract position while waiting for something better. Before, those conversations rarely happened in front of me because they didn't need to think in those terms. I had unknowingly functioned as the emergency extension cord plugged in when power dipped. Now, without that extension, they had to manage the current themselves. And here's the part that surprised me most. They didn't crumble. They adjusted. There was mild stress, mild discomfort, a little more caution, but no collapse, which forced me to confront something uncomfortable inside myself. Had I needed to be needed more than they needed my help? It's easy to believe you're indispensable when you never test the theory. But indispensability, I learned, is often self-assigned. The real consequence wasn't their financial shift. It was the subtle emotional recalibration. My brother became slightly more formal in how he asked for help. My parents stopped assuming immediate availability. And occasionally, there was a flicker, a look, a hesitation, as if they were recalculating who I was now. Not colder, just firmer. One evening, my mother said something that lingered with me. "You've changed a bit," she observed. Her tone wasn't critical. It was curious. I didn't defend myself. "I think I've just been thinking more carefully," I replied. She nodded slowly. The consequences were not dramatic, but they were undeniable. The safety net had thinned, and instead of falling, everyone had started standing differently, including me, because the greatest consequence of saying no isn't what happens to others. It's what happens to you. I no longer felt like the family's invisible infrastructure. I felt like a participant. And participants have boundaries. The panic didn't arrive as anger. It arrived as a realization. 2 months after I said no, my brother finally secured a contract role. Not permanent, not glamorous, but stable enough to cover his expenses if he adjusted his lifestyle slightly. We were at my parents' house again when the conversation turned unexpectedly reflective. "I didn't realize how close I was to running out of savings," he admitted, staring into his glass. "I think I got comfortable." No one looked at me, but the subtext hovered. Comfortable because there was always a backup. My father spoke next. "We probably relied on you more than we should have." It wasn't a grand apology. It was quieter than that, almost observational. And that's when I understood something important. You can't reverse awareness. Once a system has been seen clearly, you can't pretend it was invisible. My mother sighed softly. "We never meant for you to feel responsible for everything." I believed her. Intent and impact are rarely identical. But here's the part that mattered. Even if they had wanted to return to the old dynamic, they couldn't. Because I couldn't. Something fundamental inside me had shifted the day I chose not to transfer that money. It wasn't about finances anymore. It was about identity. I was no longer the automatic solution, and they had felt that absence. Not as punishment, as pressure. There were moments over those weeks when I sensed small attempts to test the old system. A joking comment about how it must be nice to have a stable job. A casual mention of a large bill followed by silence. Before, those silences would have pulled a response out of me. Now, they passed. And with each unanswered prompt, the old script weakened. The panic, when it surfaced, wasn't explosive. It was subtle discomfort in realizing that the fallback option had boundaries now. That support was no longer guaranteed. That adulthood had fully arrived. At one point, my brother said something that lingered longer than anything else. "I guess I just assumed you'd always, you know." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I held his gaze. "I'll always care," I said calmly, "but I won't always fix." There was no hostility in my voice. Just finality. Too late to fix it didn't mean the relationship was broken. It meant the illusion was, they couldn't go back to expecting a silent rescue, and I couldn't go back to offering it reflexively. And that's the strange thing about boundaries. Once they're real, they don't feel negotiable. Not because you're angry, but because you're aligned. The old version of me might have softened at their discomfort, might have reassured them with an extra gesture. But the new version understood something critical. Reinforcing the old pattern would only delay their growth and my own. So I stayed steady. No speeches. No emotional victory laps. Just consistency. And consistency is what makes a shift permanent. The family dynamic hadn't shattered. It had matured. Even if that maturity felt, at first, like a loss. The actual confrontation, if you can call it that, happened weeks later. It wasn't planned. It wasn't dramatic. It unfolded in the kitchen while my mother was slicing fruit and I was drying dishes. "You know," she began carefully, "sometimes I worry we made you feel like you had to be the strong one all the time." Her tone wasn't defensive. It was reflective. I didn't rush to reassure her. In the past, I would have immediately softened it. "Oh no, it's fine. I didn't mind. I like helping. This time, I chose accuracy over comfort. I did feel that way, I said gently. She stopped slicing. Not shocked. Just listening. I don't think anyone meant to put that on me, I continued, but I took it on. And then it became normal. There was no accusation in my voice. No list of grievances. Just a calm description of reality. She leaned against the counter. We always trusted you, she said. You seemed capable. I am capable, I replied. That's not the issue. Silence settled between us, not tense, just honest. The issue, I added, is that capability doesn't equal responsibility for everyone else. That sentence hung in the air longer than anything else. Not sharp, but precise. My father entered the kitchen midway through and sensed the shift immediately. What are we discussing? He asked lightly. Expectations, my mother answered. He looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't feel like the mediator in the room. I felt like an equal. I should have asked more, he admitted, instead of assuming. It wasn't theatrical remorse. It was an acknowledgement. An acknowledgement, when it's real, doesn't need embellishment. I could have said no sooner, I replied, because that was also true. This wasn't a courtroom. It was a recalibration. There were no raised voices, no emotional explosions, just three adults recognizing a pattern that had outlived its usefulness. My brother joined us later, and the topic resurfaced briefly. I didn't realize how automatic it became, he said. I just thought, that's how it worked. That's how it worked. I agreed. Past tense. That seemed to land. No one begged me to go back. No one accused me of changing unfairly. There was, instead, a subtle respect in the air, as if clarity itself commanded it. Confrontation without heat doesn't burn bridges. It redraws maps. We weren't tearing down the family. We were restructuring it. And the remarkable thing, it didn't require anger. It required steadiness. For years, I had believed that asserting boundaries would create distance. But what it created instead was definition. And definition, I learned, is what allows relationships to mature rather than fracture. That night, when I drove home, I didn't replay the conversation anxiously. I didn't dissect every word, because nothing had exploded. Everything had simply shifted into place. If you met me today, you might not notice the difference immediately. I still show up to dinner. I still help when I genuinely want to. I still care deeply. But I no longer confuse caring with carrying. That distinction changed everything. I am still capable, still organized, still the person who can analyze a contract in under an hour and spot what others miss. The difference is this. I choose when that capability is offered. It is no longer automatically extracted. The family dynamic now feels adult. My brother updates me on his plans, not because he needs rescue, but because he values input. There's accountability in his tone that wasn't there before, not fear awareness. My parents ask instead of assuming, and sometimes they solve things before even mentioning them to me, not because I withdrew love, but because I withdrew inevitability. I used to think strength meant absorbing impact quietly. Now I understand strength as alignment. Alignment between what I value and what I allow. There is no bitterness in me. That surprises people when they hear this story. They expect resentment, a catalogue of wounds, a dramatic arc of revenge. But there isn't one, because this was never about punishing anyone. It was about no longer abandoning myself in the name of harmony. For years, I thought being the good daughter meant being endlessly available. Now I define it differently. A good daughter is honest. A good daughter is supportive within reason. A good daughter does not fund other adults' comfort to preserve an image. And perhaps most importantly, a good daughter is also allowed to be a full person, with limits, with plans, with desires that don't orbit around crisis management. I travel more now. Small trips, intentional breaks. I don't check my phone obsessively for emerging emergencies. If someone calls, I answer because I want to, not because I'm bracing for impact. The quiet hum of responsibility that used to run constantly in the background of my life has softened into something healthier. Interdependence instead of dependence. Choice instead of reflex. And the most interesting part, the respect I once tried to earn through usefulness now arrives through clarity. When I speak, they listen differently. Not because I'm louder, because I'm precise. I didn't lose my family when I said no. I lost a role. And that role had been too small for me for a long time. I am still Xenia, still steady, still thoughtful. But now, when I look at my life, I don't see an invisible infrastructure holding everyone else up. I see a woman standing on her own foundation, and that foundation is mine. For most of my life, I believed love meant immediacy. Immediate solutions, immediate availability, immediate sacrifice. I believed that if I could fix something, I should, because that's what a good daughter does. But here's what I learned. Love without boundaries quietly becomes expectation. Expectation without awareness quietly becomes entitlement. And entitlement, even unintentional, erodes respect. The day I said no wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even dramatic. It was a single word delivered calmly, without apology. And that one word shifted the entire family dynamic. Not because it punished anyone, but because it interrupted a pattern. Sometimes we think change requires confrontation. Sometimes we think power requires volume. But the most permanent shifts happen in silence. When you stop cushioning outcomes, when you stop volunteering beyond your limits, when you stop performing a role you never consciously agreed to. I wasn't the good daughter because I sacrificed everything. I was the good daughter because I finally told the truth. And the truth was simple. I will care, I will support, but I will not disappear. If you are the reliable one in your family, the strong one, the one everyone leans on, ask yourself this gently. Are you helping because you choose to, or because you're afraid of what will happen if you stop? There is nothing cruel about clarity. There is nothing selfish about sustainability. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for everyone involved. I say no once. I'm curious. Have you ever been the good one in your family? And if you stopped over-functioning tomorrow, what do you think would really happen?